When visiting museum halls filled with knightly armor, one often encounters a strange, unsettling feeling of dissonance that's hard to ignore. For decades, popular culture has imposed the image of a noble warrior, encased in steel, a hero of tournaments and distant campaigns. However, if we strip away the romantic decor and analyze these artifacts from the perspective of an engineer or a biologist, the familiar worldview begins to crumble rapidly. The official timeline in this context resembles a house of cards, ready to collapse at the slightest uncomfortable question about the physical feasibility of such items. There's a chance that society has fallen victim to a grand misconception, mistaking complex technical constructions for crude works crafted by short-statured ancestors. Research indicates that a person with a typical modern anatomy is physically unable to fit into 80% of the surviving 15th century armor. The reason lies not in height, as historians often claim, attributing it all to poor nutrition or acceleration. A careful analysis of the famous Milanese and German suits from the Maximilian era reveals a striking detail: an unimaginably narrow waist. The circumference of these steel corsets often ranges between 45 and 50 centimeters. Official science explains this as a specific fashion that even the tough mercenaries supposedly followed while risking their lives daily on the battlefield. It's hard to imagine a professional fighter, whose endurance directly depends on lung capacity, willingly trapping themselves in a vice that prevents even a deep breath. Measuring 50 centimeters and comparing this size to the human body makes it clear: this is the level of extreme exhaustion or severe rib deformation, not that of an athlete capable of effectively wielding heavy, cold weapons. Even a slender modern man's pelvic bone width and chest volume, considering all internal organs, simply wouldn't allow entrance into such a metallic casing. If we assume that biological entities indeed existed within this armor, their structure would have to differ radically from what we know. At the transition from the chest to the pelvis, humans have soft tissues and floating ribs. However, in the designs of the armor, the rib cage seems to extend downward, forming a rigid, barrel-like structure, or narrows so sharply that there's simply no physical space left for vital organs, like the stomach or intestines. Historians insist on artistic stylization and the craftsmanship of metallurgists, but armor is primarily functional protection, where any excess space becomes a vulnerability, and a lack of internal room translates into unbearable discomfort during actual combat. The masters of that time, judging by dating, possessed an extraordinary level of material processing, creating joints that are incredibly difficult to replicate today without computer numerical control machines. It's absurd to think that with such technological capabilities, they could not produce anatomically accurate items. The problem deepens when examining the lengths of limbs and the positioning of joints. Detailed measurements show that in many samples, the ratio of thigh to shin and shoulder to forearm does not conform to the human proportions of the golden section, applicable to people of any era. Knee joints are often positioned in such a way that a living person's leg would inevitably suffer serious injury or be crushed by the protective elements when bending. The angles of the elbow joints suggest ranges of motion that our joint structure cannot accommodate. These empty shells resemble not clothing, but frameworks for beings with fundamentally different biomechanics, or even parts of mechanisms that operated without living flesh inside. Studying steel armor inevitably leads to a confrontation with a physiological dead end that official science often dismisses as a mere quirk of aesthetics. Yet, for anyone familiar with the fundamentals of human survival, these metallic shells appear to be a sentence of sorts. A closer examination of the structure of these so-called steel corsets reveals a geometry that directly contradicts the body's basic needs. A waist measurement of 45 or 50 centimeters isn't just a fashion statement. It's a physical limitation that hinders normal diaphragm function. For a professional warrior engaged in extreme exertion, the demand for oxygen skyrockets, necessitating full chest movement. Attempting to perform any active task, while constricted in such a way that prevents deep breathing, would lead to unconsciousness within mere minutes. This state of atrophy or severe skeletal deformation is characteristic of those who have worn restrictive corsets for years, yet it is utterly incompatible with someone who must effectively wield heavy weaponry. Moreover, when comparing the internal volume of a cuirass with the anatomy of an adult male, questions arise regarding the placement of vital organs. The width of the pelvic bones, the muscular corset, the liver, kidneys, and spleen all require a certain amount of space, which simply isn't present in these designs. In some models, the transition from chest to pelvis is so abrupt that there is physically no room left for the intestines or stomach. The rib cage in these constructions doesn't end where biology would dictate. Instead, it morphs into a rigid, barrel-like structure, seemingly ignoring the existence of the soft tissues in the abdominal cavity. Such design features suggest that the artisans intentionally crafted these shells for beings with a fundamentally different body structure. The logic of military evolution dictates that any protection should enhance a fighter's effectiveness rather than render them helpless and constrained. If armor is created as a functional tool, then the lack of space for organs and the inability to breathe indicate that the entity inside did not require these processes in the way we understand them. We see rigid capsules whose proportions are dictated by technical necessity rather than biological comfort. Even if we entertain the existence of a caste of individuals with deformed bodies from childhood, it does not explain how they maintained the physical strength necessary for hours of combat. Any deviation from anatomical norms leads to a decrease in endurance and strength. Yet here we observe the opposite. Armor that should hinder is regarded as the pinnacle of warrior gear. This monstrous disconnect between the form of the metal and the capabilities of living flesh compels us to seek alternative explanations for what truly lay within these steel shells and how these entities functioned in reality. The mismatch in proportions within the construction of medieval armor goes far beyond issues of breathing or waist size. When we analyze these creations through the lens of biomechanics, it becomes clear that they violate fundamental principles of human anatomy. There exists a so-called golden ratio that defines a harmonious and functional relationship between the lengths of bones and the positioning of joints, a principle that has remained constant for our species over millennia. However, the steel shells displayed in museum halls reveal an entirely different engineering logic. Upon closer inspection of the joints, elbows and knees, one uncovers a startling detail. They are often misaligned with the natural positions of human joints. If a living person attempts to bend their leg in such armor, their kneecap would be subjected to immense steel pressure, while the lower leg would find no support for movement. Instead of protecting the limb, this design would act as a trap, breaking bones with any attempt at active motion. The geometry of these pieces suggests a different lever mechanism, where the bending points are positioned higher or lower than human joints, and the range of motion exceeds what our ligaments and tendons can handle. The elements designed to protect the arms appear particularly odd. In many preserved examples, the ratio of the upper arm to the forearm is crafted in proportions that render the human elbow unusable as a pivot point. Steel seems to impose its will, dictating trajectories that would lead to immediate tearing of soft tissues. This is not a blacksmith's mistake. Creating such complex, articulated joints demands precision and an understanding of material science. It is hard to believe that craftsmen capable of fitting hundreds of small plates with micron-level accuracy could so grossly misjudge the basic anatomy of their client. All of this suggests that the armor was not designed as clothing, but rather as an external rigid framework, an exoskeleton. In such a system, the internal entity might not possess a skeleton in our understanding, or its joints operated on a different principle altogether. We see a shell intended to transfer force from some internal drive to external levers, where human anatomy would merely be an obstacle. Moreover, many of the fastening points and internal grooves appear to be designed for coupling with technical components, rather than for contact with skin or the fabric of a padded garment. When we look at these empty steel figures, we see not just a warrior's protection, but a technical solution for the movement of an object whose biomechanics were more efficient than ours, yet required rigid fixation. This is not merely uncomfortable clothing, it is a functional part of a mechanism into which a person, with their fragile bones and soft joints, simply does not fit. And while mechanical questions may leave us puzzled, the physical processes occurring within such a closed system elevate the discussion to the realm of the impossible. After all, beyond movement, any living being requires thermoregulation, which within a dense steel capsule transforms into a deadly trap. The closed metal contour of armor creates not only anatomical, but also formidable physical barriers that rarely cross the minds of exhibition visitors. We're talking about thermodynamics, a science that can't be deceived by decorative embellishments or references to the endurance of ancestors. Any intense physical exertion, especially a fierce hand-to-hand confrontation, inevitably generates a colossal amount of thermal energy. In those moments, the human body turns into a working engine, emitting up to 1,000 watts of heat. And this heat has to go somewhere. When the body is tightly encased in steel, natural cooling mechanisms like sweating and convection practically cease to function. Metal has high thermal conductivity, but it also acts as a shield, reflecting internal infrared radiation back to the skin. According to the official narrative, a padded garment called an acetun was always worn beneath the armor, a thick quilted underlayer made of layers of linen or wool. However, from a physics standpoint, this combination turns the warrior into a reverse thermos. The dense fabric acts as an ideal insulator, trapping heat inside. When body temperature rises above 41 degrees Celsius, irreversible processes begin to destroy proteins in the blood. A professional fighter in full gear under the blazing sun or amidst the chaos of battle would risk suffering a heat-related incident and losing consciousness after just 15 to 20 minutes of vigorous movement. Interestingly, upon examining many original cuirasses, strange technological openings are discovered, which historians often refer to as attachments for decorative elements or early ventilation systems. However, their placement and configuration resemble ports for connecting forced cooling systems or liquid circulation. Without actively dissipating excess energy, existence within such a sealed shell under high loads becomes biologically impossible. If these were combat units, they were either not biological in our understanding or possessed an external life support system that has not survived to this day. This thermal barrier raises doubts not only about the feasibility of prolonged battles, but also about the very logic of using armor as we are presented with it. Physics dictates its own rules. Either the armor was used in an environment with extremely low temperatures, or it was part of a more complex technical system. But while adult models can still be somewhat justified by the spirit of chivalry, the existence of tiny armor for children completely leads the official narrative into a dead end, turning history into something truly sinister. The existence of tiny armor pieces, which historians hastily label as prince's child gear, stands as one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the history of metallurgy. At first glance, the idea of training heirs to the throne from a young age seems logical if one overlooks the harsh realities of growth physiology. A child is an organism in a constant state of transformation. Bones, joints, and soft tissues change their proportions monthly. Crafting an incredibly complex, millimeter-fitted steel suit for a 5-year-old is an absurd waste of colossal resources, as in just 6 months such an outfit would not only be too small, but also dangerously constrictive, risking circulation issues. Yet, what shocks even more than their existence is the evidence of use found on these artifacts. Many of the child breastplates and helmets bear dents from combat weapons, chips, and characteristic damage that could not have occurred during a practice duel in a castle courtyard. These are marks of real, fierce confrontations. It seems ludicrous to think that rulers of the past would send their young children into the heat of battle clad in armor worth a fortune. The biological dead end here is evident. If these aren't children, then who are they? The proportions of these small armors often echo the same peculiarities found in adult models: unnaturally narrow joints and specific body fittings. This raises the hypothesis of a separate category of beings or specially bred low-stature pilots whose anatomy was initially adapted for these steel shells. In a world where every centimeter of metal and every hour of a craftsman's labor were worth their weight in gold, the creation of entire arsenals of small-sized gear suggests the formation of whole units comprised of these short-statured yet incredibly well-protected individuals. If we consider these objects not as toys for the aristocracy, but as functional combat gear for a specific type of performer, the picture becomes even more unsettling. These are not little people, but standardized combat components. The question of their origin is inextricably linked to the power of the industry that produced them. After all, to equip an army with such high-tech shells, an industrial base was required, the traces of which have mysteriously vanished from our memory, leaving only ghostly hints of factories that operated during the depths of the medieval era. All these thousands of identical rivets and perfect curves of steel plates lead us to the realization that we are not dealing with a blacksmith's hammer, but with the might of automated production. The scale of the preserved steel legacy stands in stark contradiction to the historical narrative presented in textbooks. We are led to believe that in an agrarian society, where wood and muscle power were the primary sources of energy, there existed thousands of artisanal workshops capable of producing tens of thousands of perfect suits of armor. However, metallurgy is not merely an art. It is fundamentally a precise calculation of resources. To smelt and process just 1 ton of high-quality steel requires an enormous amount of charcoal. If armor production truly had the mass scale suggested by museum collections around the world, all of Europe would have turned into a treeless desert by the 15th century. Yet, in the geological layers of that era, we find no mountains of slag comparable to the volumes of knightly metal, nor any signs of ecological collapse from rampant deforestation. Such large-scale production demands industrial capabilities: blast furnaces with forced air, alloy purification systems, and standardized rolling mills. When examining the surfaces of many armors under a microscope, details emerge that cannot be explained by handcrafting. We observe marks typical of industrial stamping and rolling. The thickness of the steel sheets in different parts of the piece is maintained with precision to tenths of a millimeter, something unattainable when working with a hammer by eye. Moreover, the chemical composition of the metals in armors found across the globe is sometimes identical to within hundredths of a percent of impurities. This directly indicates a unified standard of raw materials and centralized production. The very connections of the plates are often made using technologies reminiscent of precision welding or molecular sintering. In an era when, according to official accounts, humanity had barely mastered the watermill, someone was operating factories capable of producing millions of identical rivets and joints, completely interchangeable with one another. This is not a custom order for a baron. This is mass-produced goods for the general consumer. If production was automated and operated according to unified blueprints, then the scale of this industry suggests the existence of a global logistics network, erased from official memory. We are dealing with artifacts from a civilization that knew no energy shortage and possessed material processing technologies comparable to modern aerospace standards. And when we realize that this power was directed towards creating hundreds of thousands of identical steel shells, the most chilling question arises: for what bio-entities were these perfect parts stamped? The answer lies within the very structure of the management of these legions, where the individuality of the warrior was sacrificed for the standardization of an incubator. The unification we observe when studying the arsenals of the past is truly astonishing. In an era where manual labor and a personalized approach to each client officially reigned supreme, we encounter a disconcerting uniformity among thousands of artifacts. If armor is the expensive gear of a noble knight, then why do the surviving examples look as if they rolled off the assembly line of a modern defense manufacturer? The concept of individuality is completely erased, making way for the rigid standardization typical of mass-produced items. The sizes and specifications of these steel shells around the world have been reduced to just a few basic types. This is not clothing tailored to fit, but rather standard modules designed for typical biological units. In this context, the legends of loyal vassals and personal guards take on a different, more technical hue. It's likely that we are talking about mass production not only of armor but also of their bearers. The uniformity of the armor's parameters suggests that inside were beings unfamiliar with genetic diversity, essentially bio-objects cultivated for specific technical purposes. Particular attention is drawn to the fastening systems of these constructions. Many armors are equipped with complex hidden locks and mechanisms that are nearly impossible to open from the inside. A person placed within such a shell becomes its captive, completely losing autonomy. This transforms the armor into a mobile prison or an external control system, where the wearer is merely a biological component, and control over their actions can be exerted from the outside. Here, steel serves not to protect life, but to keep the biological component within predetermined limits. Such a concept explains the absence of unnecessary details and embellishments on mass-produced examples. Everything is extremely functional, all subordinated to a single protocol. Before us stands not an army of individuals, but a legion of biomechanical units whose uniqueness has been sacrificed for absolute interchangeability. This was a force operating on entirely different management principles, where each knight was merely expendable material in a vast war machine. But if we are dealing with the serial production of bio-objects and their steel shells, a question arises about the environment in which they functioned. Armor is just one part of a vast system, and if it doesn't fit us in terms of size and physiology, perhaps the surrounding world of old Europe was not constructed for our kind at all. The answer lies in the scale of the architecture, which for a long time was considered excessive, but upon closer inspection proves to be the only suitable environment for those who truly owned this world. The mismatch between the anatomy of armor and the human body is just the tip of the iceberg, leading us to a realization of a much larger substitution. If the steel shells were not meant for us, it stands to reason that the space they inhabited was constructed according to different standards. Looking at what we term ancient and medieval architecture, we uncover the same anomaly. Gigantic doors towering 5 to 7 meters high, enormous steps, and ceilings soaring to unreachable heights. Historians label this as excess for the sake of grandeur, but in a world where every cubic meter of stone and firewood for heating required immense effort, such extravagance seems downright irrational. The picture becomes clearer if we entertain the idea that this architecture was purely utilitarian for beings 4 or 5 meters tall. In this frame of reference, the steel armor we consider adult gear turns out to be merely equipment for their smaller units or auxiliary biomechanical beings. We inhabit cities that are not built for our size, using buildings as mere backdrops, the true purpose of which has long been forgotten. The empty cities depicted in the paintings of ruinist artists are not the fanciful creations of their authors, but rather documentary evidence of the Great Reset era, when the former rulers of the world vanished, leaving behind only empty stone boxes and mountains of metal that we struggle to comprehend. There exists a hypothesis of an instantaneous global catastrophe that wiped out the biological life of the previous civilization, but spared their infrastructure and steel creations. Survivor groups, located on the periphery or in special shelters, emerged into a world they had not constructed. They discovered arsenals of high-tech iron skin and began to utilize it as best as their different anatomy allowed. Thus, the cargo cult of knighthood was born. People attempted to emulate those who had ruled this world before them, squeezing into foreign exoskeletons and fabricating legends of nobility to mask the reality of mere looting amidst the ruins of a grand past. This period in official history is disguised as the Dark Ages, a time for which almost no direct written evidence remains, except for those penned much later. It was an era of total reality reformatting, where massive cathedrals were repurposed into temples and high-tech ports and factories were declared the castles of feudal lords. We are a species that has lost its memory, living in a post-apocalypse that has dragged on for centuries. We have been convinced that we are evolving from simple to complex, but the facts tell a different story. We are merely trying to grasp the remnants of a legacy that was the standard before the planetary cleansing. And while we cling to tales of blacksmiths with hammers, the true reasons for our current state remain hidden behind the walls of museums and the pages of falsified chronicles. Why is the truth about the iron skin so meticulously guarded today? A carefully constructed wall of silence surrounds the true nature of knightly armor, upheld not only by the inertia of academic thought, but also by strict control over access to artifacts. If independent research groups, equipped with modern spectrometers and deep scanning systems, were allowed to conduct a thorough analysis of museum exhibits, the official narrative would crumble into dust within days. This is why any attempts to challenge the functionality of armor are met with aggressive rejection or ridicule. Those who hold the keys to the storerooms are well aware this iron skin is not a warrior's protection, but evidence of a planetary-scale enigma. The concealment of humanity's past setbacks and the substitution of this history with a fictional chronicle of gradual progress serves a singular purpose: to deprive us of understanding the true capabilities of technology. We have been convinced that we are at the pinnacle of development, while we are merely timidly approaching the level of automation and materials science that was standard in the so-called Dark Ages. The Scaligean timeline was created to fill the void left after a global reset and to legitimize the right of new elites to manage the ruins of a great empire. However, it is impossible to hide the truth forever. Today we witness a strange phenomenon. Modern advancements in robotics and exoskeletons, such as projects from leading global laboratories, astonishingly begin to replicate those impossible joints and mechanisms that we see in Maximilian's armor. Humanity, driven by collective memory, unconsciously attempts to restore old blueprints, recreating a system for controlling bio-objects. The new iron skin is already being forged within the walls of closed corporations, and its proportions once again begin to dictate terms to the body, disregarding the comfort and natural anatomy of living humans. We live in the backdrop of someone else's spectacle, passing by buildings that loom large over us and gazing at armor that feels too small. The answers to the fundamental questions of history lie on the surface, right behind the museum glass. All it takes is a moment to stop believing in tales of artisanal production and acknowledge the obvious. Before us are products of a highly advanced industry whose cycle may repeat itself once more. Those who once pressed the stop button and turned a flourishing civilization into clay and dust may return. And then the empty steel shells will once again fill with movement, reminding us of who truly holds dominion over this planet. The iron skin does not merely protect, it waits for its moment, when the cycle of history will close, and the past we have so diligently tried to forget will become our inevitable future.
Subscribe, because what comes next is something you've never heard before.